It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. Well, this week, it's finally time to talk about 1962's King Kong versus Godzilla. And the reason why I'm talking about it is because, fingers crossed, in just a few weeks, the 2021 version of Godzilla vs. Kong will be out not only in theaters, but hopefully on HBO Max as well. Now, I say hopefully and fingers crossed and all that because just to pull back the curtain a little bit on this show and the behind-the-scenes action here that is me presenting to you this show. I record these well in advance for various reasons, but it just so happens that right now it's January. And as far as I know, I will be seeing Godzilla vs. Kong one way or another, be it through HBO or somehow, some way I end up getting vaccinated so I can go back to the theaters. But either which way, it seems like we're still on track to see these two titans of giant monster film land, filmdom, whatever you want to call it, will be going back at it and kind of going to blows over whatever. So with that said, I wanted to make sure this month kind of highlights some stuff that will be surrounding all of these, or particularly surrounding all of the big happenings in the world of Toho and Godzilla and King Kong. So this week I'm going to talk about 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla, and then next week I've got another Toho movie before going into Kong Skull Island, and then eventually Godzilla vs. Kong, and then Rebirth of Mothra 2. Get back to that series. So May is going to be devoted to those kooky, crazy kaiju from Japan, and hopefully everything works out and we don't have to call an audible when it's about damn time that we see the new Godzilla vs. Kong. But all right, so let's get back on track here. King Kong vs. Godzilla. 1962 was when it was released to Japan. 1963 released here in America after an American version was edited from the Japanese movie that was shipped over to us. This is the third film in the Godzilla series. It's the first of the 60s, as well as the first one made in color. The two previous movies, of course, Godzilla, King of the Monsters, or Gojira, as well as Godzilla Raids Again. Both of those were, of course, shot in black and white. They were released 8 and 7 years prior, if you were living in Japan at the time. But this is also the second Godzilla movie to be directed by Ishiro Honda. Now, Honda, he was only unavailable for Godzilla Raids Again just because he was wanting to work on a different movie, and they kind of rushed Godzilla Raids Again into production. If you want to know more about that, I've covered that on this show previously. Just search for that and you'll find it. However, he was still working with kaiju movies. He did The Mysterians, which is next week's movie. He did Rodan. He did Mothra. All of these movies prior to or in between, I should say, Gojira and King Kong versus Godzilla. He also worked on some comedies in between working on kaiju movies, and he used a kind of a traditional Japanese stand-up technique that is called manzai, which is not uniquely Japan, except for it's unique to their style of comedy, particularly in the 50s, and what they would do, from the mid-century, honestly, probably still to this day. But manzai is essentially the good old classic style of having a funny man and a straight man. And you have that kind of straight man and his foil sort of idea, and that's kind of at play in this. He really kind of wanted to lighten up the mood of these movies. The previous kaiju movies he made were a little bit more serious, and he wanted to kind of lighten that tone. So he was kind of interjecting that into this story, which oddly enough was not his intent for the monsters, the characters of King Kong and Godzilla, to also have these kind of lighthearted personalities. That kind of happened by accident. I've got more to say about that later in the episode, but that also kind of came along. This was kind of the beginning of Godzilla's big time rise to stardom. The 60s would prove to be an exceptional decade for Godzilla, and would really make him the superstar that we know him today. But Toho, on the other hand, was celebrating its 30th anniversary in 1962. They had a huge slate of very, very popular and very big-time movies that they were throwing a lot into. One of those movies was Akira Kurosawa's Sanjuro, was basically probably the headlining movie of that year for them. But they were able to take advantage of this big celebration and this big desire to have these big-time movies, and secured the rights to include King Kong in one of their monster movies. However, there's a little bit of controversy around this. And there's a lot of really interesting kind of behind the scenes stuff that was going on. You see, King Kong was kind of slated to return to theaters anyway, at least over here. Willis O'Brien had been kind of working on sketches, ideas. He was working with Universal to make a movie that would essentially be King Kong versus Frankenstein, whereas a giant version of Frankenstein's monster would battle King Kong. What ended up happening was that Universal didn't have the rights to the character of Frankenstein. They only had the rights to the image of Frankenstein from their older movies. So it went through various iterations where King Kong would return to fight some sort of a monster. Well, there was an American producer by the name of John Beck who, behind the backs of Willis O'Brien and Marion C. Cooper, who of course Cooper was the big producer of the 30s King Kong as well as Mighty Joe Young. Well, Beck had kind of worked behind their backs and sold the rights to this King Kong movie idea to Toho. And this infuriated Willis O'Brien and Cooper. In fact, Cooper would really try to basically sue everybody around this. He tried to sue Toho. He tried to sue Universal. He even tried to sue John Beck to stop the production or stop the release of this movie. Basically, he would say that he had the sole ownership of the King Kong character, which is not exactly true because Willis O'Brien has a part of that too, as King Kong's quote-unquote creator. But ultimately, the lawsuit didn't go anywhere. And it didn't stop Toho from being able to make this movie. What's kind of funny is that this is not the only time King Kong has been in litigation about who owns the character, who owns the rights. In fact, I think the 1976 version of King Kong had some legal issues between Paramount and I think Universal. But Universal definitely, by the end of the 70s, was in a huge lawsuit at the end of the 70s into the 80s, I think, was in a huge lawsuit with Nintendo over their character of Donkey Kong. And they were claiming that they owned the rights to King Kong, which they showed up to court. Nintendo was feeling confident, but they were a small company at that time, and they stood up to Universal instead of backing down. And it was a good thing they did, because when Universal showed up in court, pretty much it was immediately revealed that no, Universal doesn't own any right to King Kong. So King Kong has been a very contentious, a legal contention type of situation for a very, very long time. It was one thing that really kind of put Nintendo on the map because they stood up to a big Hollywood studio and won. And it from that, Nintendo had a very popular character in King Kong. So I'm kind of rambling about all these, or Donkey Kong, I should say. I'm rambling on about all of these other things that are not about King Kong versus Godzilla, but let's get into that movie. It's kind of an interesting movie because the American version is the only version that we have access to here in the States. I watched the Criterion collection of this. I have all of the Showa era Godzilla movies in the Criterion collection, and almost pretty much all of those that there is a Japanese version, it is either included on a disc or it is the only version you can watch in that collection. And King Kong versus Godzilla does not have that option. And it's really peculiar because you can really tell what was produced by John Beck for the American audience. It opens with this reporter who is a UN reporter, and it almost feels like, like those kind of like the Armed Forces radio type of stuff where it's kind of like beamed out to all over the world, but it is specifically UN based. And this guy is talking about earthquakes that are happening, these crumbling icebergs and that come from this glacier that's heading towards Japan. He's also talking about this red berry that's found on a particular island called Faroe Island that also apparently is home to a very strange giant creature that they consider a god. And he's just kind of setting up the movie for us. We then meet Mr. Taco, who is the head of Pacific Pharmaceuticals, and he's really frustrated with the ratings of the shows that his company sponsor. TV was a massive, massive thing in Japan at the time. So it was really, really important for businesses to sponsor these TV shows because it was able to get their product in front of the viewers, and it was a very, very big deal in Japan. And in fact, Ishiro Honda wanted to kind of poke a little bit of fun about how TV is kind of taken over everybody's lives. Mr. Taco is very, very adamant that they need something to energize their sales and energize the ratings of the shows that they sponsor. So he wants two of his guys named Osamu and Kensaburo to go out to Faroe Island to bring back the monster that they're hearing about on the news. Meanwhile, a UN sub goes out to investigate the icebergs, and when they get stuck in the iceberg begins to break up, and that reveals Godzilla. And Godzilla immediately blows up the sub and then wrecks an Arctic UN base. This is the same iceberg or icy structure that he was supposedly trapped in the previous movie, which was Godzilla Raids Again. So, there is some continuity here with the previous Godzilla movies, which is also kind of nice. Well, Mr. Taco gets really, really frustrated about hearing about all this Godzilla stuff, so he really wants his guys to find this monster so that he has his own monster to attract eyeballs and attract attention. So his two guys do arrive on Faroe as Godzilla kind of continues his rampage towards Japan. And that night that Osamu and Kensaburo arrive on Faroe Island, a giant octopus attacks the villagers, but King Kong comes along and fights off the octopus. But King Kong ends up drinking a bunch of like this juice that's made by these red berries that The guy at the beginning of the movie was talking about it's something that Pacific Pharmaceuticals also wants possession of. And what it ends up doing is it kind of makes him drunk and pass out, which at that point allows for Pacific Pharmaceuticals to nab King Kong to take him back to Japan. However, because of the whole Godzilla problem, they can't bring King Kong in. And so Godzilla's on the mainland of Japan, messing stuff up. King Kong is asleep on this raft that as they try to figure out what to do with him. He begins to wake up and he ends up escaping, and almost immediately comes face to face with Godzilla. Well, because Godzilla has this that atomic breath deal, it causes King Kong to essentially retreat very quickly, and he looks kind of dejected that he can't just go up and beat up this thing. He's no longer the king of his domain anymore, right? He's moved off of his island, off of his home base. Well, so now Japan has two monsters rampaging through. Godzilla, who is making his way towards Tokyo, and King Kong, who's just kind of out there. And this is where it's very important to understand something that had never really been discussed before with either of these characters. Japan's defense people decide to erect electrical high-tension wire to surround Tokyo to keep Godzilla out. Godzilla apparently is not a fan of electricity. Meanwhile, the problem with that is that apparently King Kong is strengthened by electricity. So when King Kong basically gets hopped up on electricity and starts messing around in Tokyo, they have to use the red berry juice stuff to put him to sleep again. And then they use helicopters and helium balloons to take King Kong to wherever Godzilla is, and then just let the two duke it out. You got two giant monsters, let them kill each other, basically. And this fight is actually pretty iconic in the Godzilla universe, if you will. In this, it basically turns into a wrestling match. And it makes sense because professional wrestling was very, very popular in Japan, particularly on TV. So basically, Ishiro Honda is making a movie that says, hey, you know what? I can do better than televised wrestling. I'll give you a movie of the two most famous monsters basically duking it out in living color, no less. And that's really how this turns out. Like, King Kong is able to grab Godzilla by his tail and kind of whip him around and throw him. Godzilla knocks King Kong into rocks that knocks him out. At one point, King Kong grabs a tree and is shoving it down Godzilla's throat. It's a knockdown, drag-out fight, and just when you think Godzilla's got the upper hand, King Kong gets struck by lightning, which then essentially gives him the upper hand. But they fall into the ocean. Godzilla is not seen. But we do find out that King Kong is basically swimming back to Faroe Island. What's interesting about that is that for about 30 years, there was this misconception of there being two different endings to this movie. That in Japan, there was an ending that indicated that Godzilla won, and in the United States, the ending showed that King Kong won because he was the one who basically emerged from the ocean, and you can see him swimming off into the sunset. But the thing is that's bullshit. The truth is that this is the end of the movie. Godzilla just retreats, King Kong retreats, it's a draw, and that's it. Nobody wins because they both had their own separate attacks. Like King Kong, when he got charged up with electricity, he was super strong, but Godzilla had the tail that he could use to whip, and he also had the atomic breath that he can use from afar. So there was really no way to pick a winner in this, and certainly Japan wasn't going to have their guy lose outright. And so there's no reason for there to be two different endings. It's just it ended in a drop. And that's it. Also, the whole thing about King Kong being juiced up by electricity, that almost feels like that is a remnant of the original King Kong versus Frankenstein movie that was planned. However, there was also some idea or some consideration of having a Godzilla versus a Frankenstein monster. Either which way, the idea of electricity supercharging a character seems to almost be kind of left from the leftover remnants of this idea of this Frankenstein monster movie that they wanted to do. All right, so let's get into my 3 likes for King Kong versus Godzilla, the 1962 version. First and foremost, the tone. I had kind of touched upon this earlier. This is really the tone setter for the rest of the original era Godzilla movies. It's a lot more lighthearted. There is some kind of human stuff going on. This movie has one of the longer stretches of just monster on monster fighting, even though it does cut back to humans every now and then. But this is really kind of a tone setter, and it's a very lighthearted movie, and you can really tell that there was an effort to really make this accessible to all ages. There's plenty of action with Godzilla and King Kong for kids to get excited about. There was enough for the parents of those kids to kind of get into with the human side of it. There's a lot of kind of just much more lighthearted in nature. And that kind of goes right into my second like. This is not just the tone setter for the rest of the Showa era Godzilla movies, but when most people who grew up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s think about Godzilla, and they think about those movies that they watched on cable, or they watched it on the local. For me, it was Channel 4 locally on Saturday afternoons when I was a real little kid in the 80s. But this is the beginning of the very Godzilla that I immediately think about. As good as the first Godzilla movie is, and as much as the second Godzilla movie tried to kind of live up to that first one, really the idea of giving the monsters these kind of human attributes and personalities is something that will remain for the remainder of this original series until 1975. Godzilla seems to almost have a personality. King Kong has a personality. Like I said, when King Kong retreats the first time, he looks dejected. When Godzilla wins or does something that he's proud of, he kind of claps and he celebrates. This is the very, very beginning of that era, or of that idea of what most people of a certain age are going to think of when they think of Godzilla. The more recent Godzilla is what the younger people are going to be thinking about now, but this is the exact version of Godzilla that I think of, and it starts right here. And this is really the beginning of the turn towards the light, if you will. And Godzilla starts becoming, it's just a couple of years from here that he is a hero and not a villain character anymore. In this, he's still a danger, a threat. And in a way, I think you can almost directly tie that to the Japanese perception of the Americans. If you think about Godzilla being something that was created from the devastation that we brought to them at the end of World War II with the nuclear bomb, and how something as great as nuclear energy could be perverted into a weapon that they made the allegory with Godzilla. If you take that and you say, okay, well, if Godzilla might be the representation of the destruction that the Americans brought, well, 10, 15 years later, 20 years later, by the end of this run of these movies, it's a different relationship that the United States and Japan has. and it is represented that way by Godzilla as well. So it's you really kind of start seeing the beginning of this kinder, gentler, heroic Godzilla, and that's my favorite Godzilla. I know maybe not for everybody, but that is for me. Third, and this is something that I wouldn't normally talk about in these types of movies, but I think this gives me a perfect opportunity to talk about it. But there's a particular actress in this movie who is named Mae Hama. And Hama was not just in this King Kong versus Godzilla movie, but in 1967 she was also in King Kong Escapes, which was the other Toho King Kong movie. But she was also in 1967 the role of Kissy Suzuki in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice. And the reason why I wanted to bring this up, because I always considered the idea of if you were a young, or in your early 20s or mid 20s or even late 20s, if you got a role in one of Toho's Godzilla movies, it was almost like getting, it was almost like somebody in the West becoming a Bond girl. And the reason why I say that is that every single Godzilla movie, doesn't matter what era, doesn't matter which movie it is, there is an attractive, young, and very pleasant Japanese woman in the cast. She's oftentimes one of the characters' girlfriends or wives, or maybe it's one of the little kids' mothers, which was often more seen in the Gamera movies. But the point is that they almost always fit a certain attractive but not sexy kind of thing that is, somebody that's like, wow, she's really pretty, and you just kind of like it's just a very calming look about them, and it they're just attractive enough to where you have to assume that there is a search going on, much the same as what the Bond producers used to go on for their searches for Bond girls. And for Hama to be in this and also later to be a Bond girl, it's kind of a perfect symmetry. And it was one of those situations where I always think that when I think about the actresses that are in each of the Godzilla movies, they're just attractive enough to make you think that there was enough of a search to go on to make this almost like getting the role of a Bond girl. And it's just one of those things I've always thought about with this series, and this was the perfect opportunity to talk about it. But that will be my third like for this movie. This is one of the better Godzilla movies, period. It's fun, it's exciting, you get two really recognizable characters, there's a lot of things to like about it, it's an enjoyable watch, you get a lot of monster action in this, which is not always common with the Godzilla movies over the years, but it is something that is just a really fun movie, and I'm glad that finally these two are going to eventually get back together in a brand new movie. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Now, don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on FilmSeizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify. We're even on Audible, which you can get through Amazon. Additionally, you can hop on over to Facebook and Twitter and follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, you can head over to my website, www.bmovieanima.com, and you can read new text articles each and every Friday about a B movie or a bad movie in general. You can also follow B Movie Anima on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B Movie Anima. And hey, while you're at it, go on over to YouTube and follow the B Movie Anima channel, where you can find episodes of my movie hosting show, and get ready for season 2 of B Movie Anima, the series, starting this September. So until next week, everybody, stay spooky.